On the surface, this year's GP850 lineup of monitors by LG looks nearly identical to the 2020 GN model, which was already basically the same monitor to the 2019 GL model but with an updated stand. But unlike going from the 2019 to the 2020 model where there was just an aesthetic change, this 2021 model has some actual under-the-hood improvements that make the overall usage and gaming experience better. A couple of those changes are better pixel response times across the board. So not only are things going to look clearer, but you also have a higher native refresh rate of 165 Hz instead of 144 Hz, with the ability to overclock to 180 Hz. That's a pretty good increase from 144 Hz. Combine that with the FreeSync Premium Pro and G-Sync compatible 1440p Nano IPS panel, and you have a monitor that on the surface seems like it can do it all. But can it? Before we start, this is the 32-inch model, and while I do prefer the 27-inch model for 1440p, this is the one that I was sent, but pretty much everything between the 27-inch model and the 32-inch model are the same, with the exception of the 27-inch looking a little bit more crisp because it has a higher pixel density. Whichever size you choose though, gaming on this monitor is a great experience. The pixel response times are very low, at least based on what I noticed, so you won't have to deal with much ghosting at all. The input lag is also very low, so you won't have to worry about the feeling of mouse smoothing or input delay. The input lag on this monitor will please almost anyone as long as that anyone doesn't require the absolute lowest input lag and fastest pixel response times that only a 1080p 360Hz monitor can provide. And even if you're that kind of person, I still think you'll be happy with how well this performs as long as you're not using it for qualifiers or tournaments. And because this is a 1440p resolution, this means that games will have a crisp image without having to enable anti-aliasing, since there's enough pixels to avoid terrible stair-stepping, even at 32 inches. Now there are some other features that'll help with the gaming experience, such as the black equalizer and whatnot, but I want to start showing you some actual results on how well the pixel response times are, because LG really improved on this compared to last year's model. If you haven't watched my review on the 2020 GN model, basically I scolded LG for wasting the highest overdrive setting with this atrocity. Who would even use this? I'll tell you who, no one. And they knew that. And while the highest setting on the new GP model still isn't a setting I'd recommend using because of the noticeable overshoot, it's still much better than the previous year's model, so I'm glad LG realized their flaws and improved on it. I still wish they did better though. No overshoot is the best overshoot. If we take a look at the rest of the settings, there really isn't much of a difference when you go from the off overdrive setting to the fast setting, but if you ask me which one I'd use, it'd be the normal setting. If you're playing a game that's struggling to get high enough frame rates, the normal setting is the highest you can go where it won't have any noticeable overshoot, all while looking not much different from the fast setting at high frame rates. So it's kind of a best of both worlds setting. And in case you're wondering how this stacks up to last year's 27GN850, here you go. This new model does really well all around, and I haven't even talked about backlight strobing. Yes, it includes backlight strobing. I remember when I reviewed my first Nano IPS monitor and wondered why there was no backlight strobing. The comments section made it clear that it had a disgusting red trail or something of the like, so manufacturers didn't include it because it wasn't good. But this one does include it, and it's not bad. Sure, there's some red in front of Alex the Alien, and changing the overdrive settings with the backlight strobing barely does anything to improve the results, but they're still impressive nonetheless, and when I'm using it in games, I didn't notice the red. Also, it probably added a few extra milliseconds of input lag, but it's probably in a range of 1 to 3 milliseconds extra because I didn't feel any difference with it on or off. Also, if you do use backlight strobing, just make sure that you're okay with the screen's maximum brightness being cut in half from 395 nits to 210 nits. It's not dark, but you may have some trouble competing with sunlight blaring in your room. If you play with the window shades closed, then this is a non-issue at all. In terms of the black equalizer, it's pretty good. Here's the black equalizer off, which is really just 50 out of 100 on the monitor setting. Then 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. In case you forgot what it looks like with it off, this is 50. So it does pretty well. On top of that, the color vibrance this monitor has is nuts. You don't have to have it as saturated as this, but if an enemy is trying to blend in with their surroundings or background, well, good luck to them trying. In terms of the game I'll be replacing Escape from Tarkov with, that'll be Warzone, since like every comment was for Warzone. But since I can't start my own match without 23 other players, I'll use Modern Warfare, which is basically the same game. So let me know what map you guys think I should test this on. Next is the color performance. A great thing about this monitor is that it's not just good in gaming, but also for media consumption, amateur content creation, and maybe even intermediate professional work. However, because of its nano IPS panel and the way LG color tuned the monitor, colors out of the box are oversaturated. This creates a nice viewing experience for the average consumer, but this isn't good for color critical work because colors just aren't accurate enough. First, let's take a look at the gamut coverage. It's great overall having wide gamut support, but if you look at the sRGB chart, things are way too saturated. Luckily, there's an sRGB profile built into the monitor which clamps the color gamut, but you lose about 3% of the sRGB color space. Sticking to out-of-the-box settings, my unit shows just how oversaturated it is, with an average delta E of 3.9 in the saturation sweep. Again, to reiterate, this is fine for the average person who just wants to watch something, even me who's used to calibrated displays, but it's not ideal if you're doing color accurate work. The same goes for the color accuracy, where colors are less than ideal for professionals with an average delta E of 4.2, and the grayscale where the average is 3.6. It seems to lean towards a reddish white. Gamma was also all kinds of fudged up. As expected, calibrating the monitor fixed the majority of inaccuracies except for the reds, at least when talking about the saturation sweep. If we look at the color accuracy, things are mostly flawless, with the highest deltas being the grays, and with an average of 0.7, which is perfect to the human eye. Then we have the grayscale, which does great as well, though not as good as other monitors that I test. Even though the average delta E of 1.5 is fantastic, it still reaches as high as 3.5 in the case of the 95% grays, and around 2 between 50 and 100%. Overall though, still good for color work. Uniformity on my unit was phenomenal, with the exception of the top left and bottom left corner of the display. Other than those anomalies, it barely goes over a delta E of 2. If we look at the 30% grays, it's just insanely uniform. This is by far the best uniformity I have ever seen on 30% grays. I don't see how any other future monitor can beat this. To top it off, because of its outstanding uniformity, there was no backlight bleed at all, but IPS glow was as standard as it gets. You'll mostly notice it if you're looking for it or if a significant part of the screen is black, but it's not noticeable if you're playing a game or watching content. Brightness is standard. It gets as bright as 395 nits, which is perfectly fine, but it only gets as low as 65 nits. While that is dark, it's not as dark as I'd like it to be. I think around 40 nits is ideal for most people in pitch black environments. You can lower the contrast, which will decrease the brightness, but you're losing contrast. Whether you think that matters with the screen being as dark as possible is up to you. And speaking of contrast ratios were bad, but standard for this type of panel at 783:1. It's one of the worst ones on this list, but really the difference from 781 to 964 is negligible. It's unlikely you'll notice a difference because 964:1 is also bad. With that said, blacks were black and highlights can get saturated, so there is more to this panel than what the numbers suggest. Then there's the viewing angles. They are flawless. It doesn't matter where you look, up, down, left, right, there's no angle discoloration or high contrast effect. This panel is as good as it gets, which I can't say the same for when it comes to HDR. It's got VESA's HDR 400 certification, but it sucks, there's no other way to put it. Not just because it only has a peak brightness of 400 nits, but it doesn't have any meaningful amount of local dimming zones, or any at all in fact. So if you're looking for a good HDR display, look elsewhere. LG has revised the OSD for this year's model, making it look more graphically cool with this wing-like design. You still have the same old navigation nipple, but hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It works just like you would expect. There are some shortcuts if you turn the nipple left or right, and you can change what those shortcuts are. Opening the full OSD presents you with your standard arrangement of settings, such as the ability to change what color profile you're on, or game mode as LG calls it. You can enable or disable backlight strobing, overclock, and adaptive sync. You can adjust your black equalizer, response time, and crosshair if the game you're playing doesn't have one. You can enable the FPS counter, adjust your brightness, contrast, sharpness, gamma, color temp, 6-color, which is used to increase the saturation for color vibrance, DFC, which just like it says, will adjust the brightness automatically according to the screen, and you can change the language and the shortcuts. Those are about the only noteworthy things in this OSD. There is also a software OSD called On-Screen, and while it's not stated on their website that it supports this monitor or any of the other older models, it works exactly the same way on this monitor as it does on my officially supported 38GN950, which is to say that anytime you drag a slider or play a game, your entire PC freezes for a few seconds. Since I know without a doubt LG is watching, please fix this. This would add another advantage compared to your competition, as they're slowly taking away support for software OSDs with each and every model they release. Last but not least, there's the design. It's no different than the last year's GN850. Like, we're talking identical. It does include a USB hub, which they had on the 2019 GL model, but then took out on the 2020 GN model, so this is nice at least. It still includes the same DisplayPort 1.4 port, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, and a headphone jack. It still has the same wire routing hook rather than a wire routing hole, but otherwise there's nothing different. If I could change one thing on the design though, it would be the legs. They just stick out too far. It's not as obnoxious as some other monitors, and it's not like it matters as much when compared to an esports monitor, but I hate monitors with legs. Yes, I think they look good, but it doesn't matter how good they look when it invades your usable mouse and keyboard space. Luckily, if you hate legs as much as I do, it does include 100 by 100 VESA mounting holes, so you can mount this to a monitor arm or a stand. But in conclusion, at a price point of $500 for the 27-inch model and $600 for the 32-inch model, is this a good monitor? And if so, should you get one? If you've watched the entire video, then you already know that this monitor is more than good. If you skip to the conclusion part because TLDW, well then yeah, it's fantastic. It has a higher native refresh rate compared to last year's model with the ability to overclock. The response times are noticeably better. They finally included backlight strobing on a nano IPS panel and it actually looks pretty decent. The black equalizer is above average and the color vibrance rivals my Zowie. The nano IPS panel produces beautiful and accurate enough colors for media consumption and amateur editing, and the OSD is good enough minus the software OSD. Really, it's almost perfect. Now sure, there are way better monitors, and those way better monitors are literally 6 to 10 times more expensive than this without being that many times better. The only thing those stupid expensive monitors have over this is actual HDR with HDR hardware and 4K. But at 27 inches, which I suspect the majority will get, 4K won't matter for most, but HDR might, in which case, get this and one of LG's CX48 OLED TVs, and you'll still save at least $1,000 compared to those monitors that do it all. That's what I would do at least. If you're interested in checking out this monitor, I'll have links in the video description. Thanks for watching and have a great day every day. Peace.